"You've always been the dependable one." My mother said those words to me the way most parents say, "I love you," like they were supposed to feel warm. I was 8 years old, standing in our driveway with a suitcase in my hand, and it would take me 19 more years to understand that sentence was never a compliment. It was a sentence, and I served it for 9 summers straight. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Avery Kensington, and this is the story of how I disappeared from my own family, and how, years later, I came back only on my own terms. The navy blue suitcase sat above the pantry in my apartment in Burlington, Vermont for years before I ever pulled it down again. I remember the night I finally did. It was late November, closing time at my bakery, the smell of cinnamon and browned butter still hanging in the air. I climbed the little stepladder, dragged the case off the shelf, and unzipped it right there on the flour-dusted counter. Inside weren't clothes. They were folded holiday tablecloths, soft with age, and underneath them, a worn leather journal filled with handwriting I would know anywhere. My Aunt Maggie's recipes, and beneath them, years later, my own. I sat down on a flour sack and held that journal for a long time. Some families pass down houses, some pass down jewelry. Mine passed down a suitcase. I decided, a long time ago, to fill it with something different. To understand why that suitcase meant so much, you have to go back to when I was 8, standing in our driveway in Indiana, watching my parents load the car for a family vacation I hadn't been invited to. My older brother Ethan had survived cancer when he was 6. I don't say that to diminish what he went through. It was real, and it terrified my parents in a way that reshaped our whole household, and I understand that now, in a way I couldn't as a child. But I was born 2 years after his diagnosis into a house that had already decided who mattered more. Ethan was the miracle. I was just there, the reliable one. The one who didn't need anything because somewhere along the way, everyone had simply decided I didn't. That first summer, I actually thought I was finally getting my turn. I thought the suitcase meant I was going with them. Instead, my mother knelt down, smoothed my hair back, and smiled like she was giving me a gift. "We never have to worry about you, sweetheart. You're the dependable one." Then she put me in the car, and we drove 3 hours north to Door County, Wisconsin, to my Aunt Maggie's orchard and bakery. My parents hugged me goodbye, got back in the car, and left for the airport with Ethan. They were going to Hawaii. I was staying with my aunt. I didn't cry that first night. I remember that clearly. I sat on the porch of Maggie's farmhouse watching the sun drop behind the apple trees and told myself it was just this once. It wasn't just once. It happened every summer for 9 years. Every June, the same routine. My parents dropped me at Maggie's, and Ethan went off to the Grand Canyon or Alaska or Yellowstone, wherever that year's family trip happened to be. And every summer, a postcard arrived at the orchard in Ethan's handwriting. "You would have loved this, Avery. Best trip ever." Not once in 9 years did anyone ask how I was doing. I wasn't being forgotten. I understood that eventually. I was being managed, kept somewhere convenient while the real family made its memories somewhere else. But here's the strange thing about those summers. They ended up saving me. While my parents were building memories with Ethan, Maggie was quietly building something else with me. She taught me to knead dough before I could reliably tie my shoes. She taught me how to tell just by smell when a pie crust needed 30 more seconds and not a moment longer. She let me stand on a step stool and ring up customers, counting back their change out loud so I'd learn it by heart. And every recipe she taught me, she made me write into that leather journal. And beneath it, in her looping handwriting, she'd add a little lesson that had nothing to do with baking at all. "Patience makes good bread," one said. "Kindness always rises," said another. "A full table starts with an open heart," said a third, next to a recipe for apple crisp that I still make every October. Maggie never once made me feel like an inconvenience. She'd sit across from me on slow afternoons at the bakery counter, flour on her forearms, and ask me real questions. What I was scared of, what I wanted, what made me laugh. Nobody at home had ever asked me those things. Some nights, after closing, we'd sit on the porch with lemonade, and she'd tell me stories about my mother as a girl before either of us understood how much that would matter later. I didn't realize until years later that Maggie was quietly building the only real inheritance I would ever receive from my family. By the time I was 12, the orchard felt more like home than my actual home did. I knew which trees ripened first, which customers liked their bread sliced thick, which mornings Maggie needed extra hands before she even had to ask. I stopped counting down the days until my parents came back for me. I started quietly dreading them instead, though I never told anyone that, not even Maggie. Going home meant going quiet again. It meant becoming background noise in a house built entirely around my brother's second chance at life. I was 14 the night I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd come downstairs for water and stopped outside the kitchen because I heard my mother's voice tight and clipped on the phone with Maggie. "I already told you, Margaret, it's not happening." I stood in that hallway, barefoot on the cold tile, and listened as Maggie, I learned this fully later, begged my mother to let me live with her permanently. A real bedroom, a new school. She'd cover every cost herself. She just wanted to give me a stable home, one where I wasn't handed off like a piece of luggage every summer. My mother's answer wasn't about money or logistics or even really about me. It was about appearances. "People will ask questions if one of my children is living somewhere else," she said. "I'm not having that conversation at church, Margaret. Avery is fine where she is." I stood in that hallway and felt something in me go very quiet and very still. I wasn't angry yet. I was just done hoping. I started planning instead. By 16, I had a job at a diner 3 nights a week, and every dollar went into an envelope hidden at the bottom of that navy suitcase. My parents assumed I was saving for college. I let them believe that. I was actually saving for a life. I spent hours in the school library after class researching small American towns, places with good bakeries, tight-knit communities, water views that reminded me of Door County. Burlington, Vermont kept coming up. Friendly, walkable, full of independent little shops that felt like Maggie's orchard, just transplanted somewhere new. I used my friend Olivia's address so nothing would come to our house, and quietly applied to bakeries there over the course of months, telling absolutely no one. One woman wrote back. Her name was Helen Parker, and she owned a place called Maple Harbor Bakery and Cafe. She said she liked the sound of a girl who'd been baking since she could reach the counter. She offered me a job before I'd even finished high school. My parents came to my graduation. They left before the reception started because Ethan had a promotion dinner in Indianapolis that same night, and of course, we all needed to be there for that. I stood in my cap and gown looking at 2 empty folding chairs where my parents should have been sitting, and I want to tell you I felt heartbroken. I didn't. I felt something closer to relief, like a door quietly clicking shut behind me, and for once, I was the one closing it. 3 nights later, before the sun came up, I loaded that navy suitcase into a second-hand car I'd bought from diner money. I left one note on the kitchen table. "I'm safe. Please don't look for me. It's time for me to build a life that's truly mine." Then I drove east, and I didn't look back once, not even the exit sign for our town. Vermont gave me everything I had never had growing up. Helen taught me things Maggie hadn't gotten the chance to: how to run payroll, how to negotiate with flour vendors, how to hold a small business together through a brutal January when nobody was buying pastries. Over 4 years, I worked my way from assistant to bread baker to pastry chef to kitchen manager. I hung a paper tracker inside my apartment closet, and every month I'd color in a little more of it, watching my savings creep toward a number I once thought impossible. Enough, eventually, for Helen to sell me the bakery through owner financing. And through all of it, that leather journal kept growing. Underneath Maggie's handwriting, I started adding my own. New recipes, small lessons I was learning entirely on my own. About patience, about trust, about what it felt like to build something that was actually completely mine. I didn't realize what I was doing at the time. I was quietly starting a second generation of a family tradition that had never once included the family I was born into. For 4 years, nobody back home knew where I was. I liked it that way. And then, this past fall, a local news station ran a segment on Maple Harbor's Thanksgiving pies. It found its way online, the way small-town feel-good stories sometimes do, and a distant cousin recognized me in the footage. 2 weeks later, my parents walked through my bakery door. I hadn't seen either of them in 4 years. My mother looked older, more tired around the eyes than I remembered. My father looked smaller somehow, leaning slightly on a cane I didn't recognize. The conversation started polite, careful, the way conversations are when everyone in the room is avoiding the real subject sitting on top of the table. Then my mother finally said what they had actually come to say. "Your father has MS, Avery. It's progressing faster than the doctors expected. Ethan can't take this on, not with his job and the girls. We need you to come home." And there it was again, wrapped in new circumstances, but unmistakably the same sentence I'd heard my whole childhood. "You've always been the dependable one." I stood behind my own counter in my own bakery and understood with total clarity that they hadn't traveled 600 miles looking for their daughter. They had come looking for a solution. That night, I called Maggie, and she finally told me something she had never told me before. Years earlier, around the time I was 14, she hadn't just asked my mother permission over the phone, she had actually gone through the legal process of preparing guardianship paperwork. She had a lawyer, she had a room ready, she was truly prepared to raise me. My mother had refused, not because she couldn't bear to let me go, but for exactly the reason I'd overheard in that hallway years before. Appearances. That was the entire reason. The summers were never a temporary arrangement. They were a carefully managed decision about which child was worth the inconvenience of raising. I flew back to Indiana for Thanksgiving, not because they'd asked me to move home, but because there were things I needed to say to their faces. What I hadn't expected was for my mother to stand up in the middle of dinner in front of my brother, his wife Lauren, and their little girl Harper, and announce, without asking me one single thing beforehand, that I would be moving back to take care of my father. Everyone at the table clapped, like it was already decided, like I was a piece of furniture being reassigned to a different room in the house. I let the applause die down. Then I stood up too. "I've already hired a home care nurse," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Her name is Monica. She's experienced, she's kind, and I've already arranged and paid for several months of care. I will always help take care of Dad. That's never going to change. But I am done disappearing to make everyone else comfortable. Helping him is my choice now. It was never supposed to be my obligation." The table went silent in a way I had never heard it go silent before. Then something happened that I genuinely did not see coming. My father, a man who had spent my entire childhood avoiding any hint of conflict the way other people avoid bad weather, set down his fork and looked directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. "We kept telling ourselves we were doing our best," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "We never once stopped to ask what it was doing to you. I hired a private investigator after you left, Almost a year, he looked. I didn't have the courage to keep fighting for it. I'm sorry, Avery. I am so sorry." It was the first real apology I had ever received from either of my parents in my entire life. Not an explanation, not a justification dressed up as regret, just sorry. Later that night, my mother found me alone in the kitchen washing dishes I didn't need to wash, just to have something to do with my hands. She told me something I had never known about her. She had become her own mother's caregiver at 12 years old. Nobody had ever asked her if she wanted that either. She had simply grown up believing love meant absorbing everyone else's burdens without complaint. And somewhere along the way, without ever questioning where the belief came from, she had passed it straight down to me. "You deserved better too," I told her, and I meant every word of it. But that story ends with us. Before I left Indiana, my brother Ethan asked to see me alone. He'd found the shoebox of old postcards I'd kept, the ones from all those summers, the ones celebrating trips I was never part of. He turned a few of them over in his hands, quiet for a long moment, like he was seeing them for the first time. "I never once turned these over and thought about what you might have been doing while I was writing them," he said, finally. "I'm sorry I never turned them over." It wasn't a grand apology, but it was honest, and it was entirely his, and it was the only one I had actually needed from him. Helen sold me Maple Harbor Bakery outright not long after I got back to Vermont. She lowered the required down payment the moment she heard the whole story, and told me she had never met anyone who'd earned it more. I hung a new sign over the front door myself on a cold Saturday morning with Olivia holding the ladder. Avery Kensington, owner and baker. It was the first place in my entire life that belonged to me and to no one else. Last Thanksgiving, I finally did something I had been dreaming about for years. I opened the bakery for a free dinner. No reservations, no exceptions. Everyone welcome. Neighbors came. College students who couldn't afford to fly home came. A few widowers who hadn't had anywhere to be in years came. A military family passing through town on their way to see relatives stopped in and stayed for hours. Maggie sat at the head of the long table, glowing, watching Harper, Ethan's little girl, help serve slices of pie made from recipes written in that same old journal, 3 generations deep now. Before anyone ate, I stood at the end of the table and looked around the room, full of people who had become something like family in a single afternoon. And I finally understood something I could never have understood as a child, sitting alone on that porch in Door County. I had spent years hoping someone, somewhere, would save me a seat at their table. Instead, I built one where nobody would ever have to wonder if they belonged. That navy suitcase still sits above my pantry. It doesn't hold childhood disappointment anymore. It holds tablecloths and a recipe journal that gets a little fuller every single year. And for the first time in my life, everyone that invitation was ever meant for is already sitting at the table. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. Every story here is about the families we're born into and the families we choose to build when the first one fails us, and your support helps us keep telling them. No matter how long you were made to feel like the dependable one instead of the loved one, it is never too late to build a table of your own and to fill every seat at it with people who actually see you. As for what the story is really about beneath the drama, It speaks to something a lot of people carry quietly for years, the wound of feeling like an afterthought in your own family, and the long, difficult process of learning that love without fairness isn't really love, it's just an arrangement. It shows that setting boundaries isn't the same as seeking revenge. Avery still helps her father, but she does it from a place of choice rather than obligation, which is a distinction many people struggle to make in real life. It also gently illustrates generational patterns, how Janice's own childhood of forced caregiving shaped the way she raised her daughter, reminding viewers that understanding where hurtful behavior comes from doesn't excuse it, but it can help break the cycle before it passes to the next generation. Ultimately, the story offers a hopeful message that the family you build through kindness, hard work, and genuine belonging can be just as real and sometimes far more healing than the family you were born into.